A content warning on this episode contains descriptions of very violent crime, including murder. The names of the known victims are used with care and respect, and I'm not going to go into the gory details. But even so, listener discretion is absolutely advised. January 25th, 1990. It's Australia Day Eve. And as per usual at this time of year, there's a pressing heat in the New South Wales tablelands, completely inescapable. The highway south of Sydney stretches out ruler straight, through dry golden grass, through gum trees bleached pale by summer, through a landscape that is enormous, and at this hour, almost entirely empty. A young British backpacker by the name of Paul Onions is standing on the shoulder of the highway with his thumb out. He's just 24 years old, a mechanic from Birmingham, and he's been in Australia for just 4 days. Everything that Paul Onions owns is in that backpack, and the straps are cutting into his shoulders. He's come here to Australia, he'll later say, because it seemed like the kind of place where you could still find an adventure, get some sun, have a good look around. He's hitched rides before in other countries, on other roads, and it's always been fine. You put your thumb out, someone stops, you have a bit of a chat. The Aussies had recently beaten the English 4-0 in the latest version of the Ashes, so he was expecting to cop a bit of flack about that. But he wasn't expecting what came next. A car slows down and pulls over. The driver is somewhere in his mid-40s, broad across the shoulders, tanned like he spent a lot of time working outside. He has a dark, thick moustache, the kind that used to be worn by Australian fast bowlers in the 70s. And an otherwise quiet, easy manner that Paul will later struggle to reconcile with everything that follows. He says his name's Bill and he's heading south, the same direction as Paul. And so Paul opens the door. He shrugs his heavy pack into the footwell and gets in. For a while, everything seems perfectly fine. The highway carries them south, the air conditioning hums. Paul watches out his window as the landscape rolls past in long, unhurried sweeps. Pale grass yellowing, and grey-green bush and the occasional farmhouse set well back from the road. If you look forward, you can see the heat shimmering off the bitumen ahead. They settle into some comfortable chit-chat. Bill's easy company, relaxed. He asks where Paul is from, how long he's been in the country, where he's headed. And then the questions start to change. Does anyone know where you're headed? Is anyone expecting you in Melbourne? Have you done any special forces training? Paul continues to answer, being polite. And as he does so, he starts to feel something deep inside him. A wrongness. Kind of like the way you can sense a change in the weather before the sky presents itself to you. The questions keep circling. They're not the questions of a man making conversation now. They're the questions of a man taking stock of the situation, like he's ticking off a particular inventory. They all seem to relate to one central theme. Is there anyone who would notice if Paul Onions ceased to exist? The car slows down. Bill says he wants to find a cassette. He pulls off the highway onto a dirt road and brings the car to a stop in a narrow clearing flanked by scrub. The engine idles. Paul looks at the trees, which are close on both sides, and at the road behind them, which has disappeared from view. He sits there in that silence, which is sudden and complete. Bill reaches down behind his seat, and he comes up with a gun in one hand and a length of rope in the other. He says, calmly but firmly, "This is a robbery." Paul Onions doesn't take time to think. He grabs his pack from the footwell, shoves the door open, and runs. He's on the highway in seconds, his boots slapping against the bitumen, the pack swinging behind him, the hot air burning in his lungs. He hears a shot fire. He doesn't look back. He keeps running, zigzagging from one side of the road to the other, arms driving, legs driving, running toward the cars he can now see in the distance coming north, running toward the world that still contains other people, toward the ordinary morning that was happening for everyone else just a few hundred metres away. A car stops. Paul gets in and the door slams closed. He's shaking, but he is alive. Later that day, Paul Onions walks into the Bowral police station and tells them everything. The man, the car, the gun, the rope, the dirt road, the direction the car was heading where he ran. He gives them everything that he has. The officer listens and he writes it all down in his notebook. And then, inexplicably, for 3 years, nothing happens. Paul Onions does not receive any further communication from the New South Wales Police. G'day, welcome back to Strewth, a podcast about the mysteries, the strange and the unresolved from Australia's past and present. I'm your storyteller Mark, and today we're delving into a case that I'm sure most of you are very familiar with. Ivan Milat, the backpacker murderer, convicted in 1996 of killing 7 young people whose bodies were found in shallow graves in the Belanglo State Forest in New South Wales. He was given 7 consecutive life sentences. So, I hear you ask, what are you doing covering this story, Mark? There's no mystery here. The murders happened. The killer was apprehended. He was charged for 7 murders. That's the number that we all know. But there is another number that I want to focus on today that's been sitting in police files since 1993. A number that until recently was not made public. A number that, when it was finally tabled in the New South Wales Parliament in August 2025, stopped people in their tracks. And that number is 58. 58 missing or murdered young people whose cases were examined by the detectives of Task Force Air, the unit that caught Ivan Milat, as having potential connection to the man. 58 cases spanning every state and territory in Australia. 58 families who spent decades not knowing what happened to someone they loved, while police sat on a list that placed their loved one's name in the orbit of Australia's most notorious killer. And beside that huge number lies another mystery that I want to try and unravel. A question that has never been conclusively answered. A question that the sentencing judge himself raised from the bench in 1996 and has hovered over this case ever since. Did Ivan Milat act alone? Ivan Robert Marco Milat was born on the 27th of December 1944, the 5th of 14 children in a Croatian immigrant family. His father worked the wharves in Sydney, eventually establishing a tomato plantation at the family property in Moorebank, out in the city's western fringes, where the boys were put to work as soon as they were old enough. The family, by all accounts, was very insular. They kept to themselves, and they were well known to the police. By his late teens, Ivan was already accumulating a criminal record. Break-and-enters, burglaries, progressively longer stints in jail. He was a good-looking lad, powerfully built, meticulous about his appearance. He liked fast cars and guns and hunting, and he bragged to people about his capacity for violence in ways that most of them dismissed as bluster. but they were wrong to dismiss it. In 1971, after his release from prison on theft charges, Milat was tried for raping two 18-year-old women he'd picked up hitchhiking. One of the women later said he had told her he often picked up hitchhikers and always carried knives and ropes just in case an opportunity arose. He was acquitted. His solicitor in this case was John Marsden. 3 years later, in 1974, he was charged again, this time for a knife-point rape. Again, he was acquitted, and again, it was Marsden who represented him. Marsden would later say, publicly, that he sometimes wondered whether getting Milat off that charge had cost people their lives. And by the time the events from our opening scene occurred, when Paul Onions got into Milat's car in January 1990, Ivan had been slipping through the cracks of the justice system for more than 2 decades already. The killings for which he was eventually convicted began in December 1989, just weeks before that Onions attack. For the purposes of this episode, I'm going to assume a level of prior knowledge about the 7 murders that Milat was convicted of. I could fill a 2-parter with those cases alone without even trying. However, I do think it's important to go over them just to give you a refresher of Milat's MO and the way he went about committing these heinous crimes. It's also important to remember that these people are far more than just that number 7. They were young people with the rest of their lives ahead of them, taken senselessly from their families. James Gibson and Deborah Everest, both from Melbourne, were heading south from Sydney when they disappeared. They were 19 years old. They were planning to meet friends, but they never arrived. Over the next 3 years, 5 more young people vanished along the same stretch of highway. Simone Schmidl, 21, travelling alone from Germany, due to meet her mother at the Melbourne airport. But she never showed up. Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschied, a German couple in their early 20s, were gone around Christmas time in 1991. And then Carolyn Clark and Joanne Walters, 2 British women in their early 20s who had met at a backpackers hostel in King's Cross, became friends and decided to travel together because there was safety in numbers. But there wasn't. It was their bodies that were the first to be found in September 1992 by 2 runners moving through Belanglo State Forest near Bowral. The discovery of the others followed over the next year. All had been shot or stabbed, or both, most of them multiple times. All had been buried in the forest floor with a care that spoke of familiarity with the terrain. By 1993, 7 bodies being found, and a task force established, the phone lines were open. Joanne Berry, the woman who had stopped her car that day for Paul Onions on the highway 3 years earlier, called in. And Paul Onions himself called from England. Police found no investigative report from his 1990 visit to the Bowral police station. Only a single entry in an officer's notebook. But by then, Ivan Milat was already a name on their list. He'd been working road construction in the areas where hitchhikers were disappearing, and the description matched. In May 1994, police raided his home at Eaglevale in southwest Sydney. What they found inside would later be described by the investigating detective, Clive Small, as an Aladdin's cave. Camping equipment and personal possessions belonging to his victims. Parts of a rifle that matched one used in the murders, ropes and plastic ties, cameras. The accumulated trophies of years of killing, kept with the casual confidence of a man who had never once been searched. He was arrested, he was tried, and he was convicted on all 7 counts. In 1996, Justice David Hunt sentenced him to serve 7 consecutive life sentences. one for each of the known dead. And then Justice Hunt said something that this episode will focus on. He said it was inevitable, in his view, that the prisoner had not been alone in that criminal enterprise. It wasn't a suspicion, it wasn't a concern. It was, in his own words, inevitable. And that word, inevitable, has sat in this case for nearly 30 years, like the tiny bit of wood that remains deep under your skin if you don't remove a splinter properly. Task Force Air investigated the possibility of an accomplice throughout the investigation, and the suspicion was not abstract. It had a name. Several names, in fact. All of them ending with Milat. Ivan, as we mentioned, came from a family of 14 children, and 9 of those were brothers. 7 of those brothers had had run-ins with the law, and when police searched the Eaglevale house and found the victim's possessions, they did not stop there. They kept searching. Camping equipment belonging to Carolyn Clark and Joanne Walters turned up in the garden of Ivan's brother, Richard. Joanne Walters' sleeping bag was found in a cupboard in the same house, and at another relative's address, more items connected to the dead were discovered. The trophies of Belanglo were distributed across the family like heirlooms. And at trial, it was Ivan's own defence barrister who drew the sharpest line towards this theory. He told the court that there could be absolutely no doubt that whoever committed all of these offences must be within the Milat family or very closely associated with it. What he was trying to achieve was to create reasonable doubt about which Milat was responsible, but what he inadvertently did was confirm that the crimes had a family geography. Richard Milat, in particular, was cross-examined at length. He sat in a witness box and was asked to explain how the property of murdered women had ended up in his garden. He simply said he couldn't explain it. He was asked about statements made by work colleagues, men who said Richard had told them he knew who killed the Germans and that there were more bodies out there that hadn't been found yet, that stabbing a woman was like cutting a loaf of bread. Richard, of course, denied saying it in that box. He denied all of it. William Milat, another brother, provided Ivan with an alibi for Boxing Day 1991, the day the 2 German backpackers disappeared. He said Ivan had been at their mother's place for their father's birthday celebration, as the family always gathered on Boxing Day. He was, in his words, 100% certain. His wife Carolyn provided a separate alibi for Ivan, placing him on a family camping holiday at Easter in 1992. During cross-examination, it emerged that she had changed the date written beneath a family photograph, altering it from Easter 1991 to Easter 1992. The revised date was the one that gave Ivan an alibi for the day the English women were murdered. Carolyn simply said she didn't remember changing the dates. She said it meant nothing to her. She said she wasn't providing an alibi, just correcting an old photo. The jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts, regardless. The alibis had not held, but nobody was charged for providing them. In 2005, John Marsden, Milat's former solicitor, who was at the time dying of cancer, told reporters that he believed a woman had been involved. Not a brother, a woman. He later indicated he thought it was Ivan's sister, Shirley, with whom family members acknowledged Ivan had an unusually close relationship, and who had died 2 years earlier. Marsden recanted the specific identification but maintained his belief until his death that someone else was present during those murders. The forensic evidence, too, muddied things even further. When investigators processed the crime scenes at Belanglo, they found things that did not fit neatly around a single killer. Near the area where Clark and Walters were found, there was a crude brick fireplace, the remnants of a camp, and scattered around it were cigarette butts and empty beer bottles. Ivan Milat did not smoke. Ivan Milat did not drink. These were not contested facts. He had no known history of either habit, and nothing found at his home or in his vehicle suggested otherwise. And so the question was straightforward and rather uncomfortable. Whose cigarette butts were they? Whose bottles? And for years this was one of the more persistent threads in the accomplice argument. Investigators examined the possibility that whoever had been present at those scenes had sat around a fire, smoked, drank, while Ivan Milat did whatever Ivan Milat did. It was not a small thing to have to explain away. But eventually it was. Police concluded that the cigarette butts and bottles were consistent with general activity in the forest. Campers and hunters and day visitors who had nothing to do with the murders. The sites had not been sealed at the time of the killings. The physical evidence was contaminated by use of the forest before and after. The bottles and butts, investigators decided, were not evidence of a second person. They were just evidence of a busy forest. It's important to note, though, that not everyone was satisfied with that conclusion. But it was the conclusion that was reached, and it removed, at least in the eyes of most, one of the more tangible pieces of evidence pointing towards Ivan Milat having company. The second forensic thread was harder to dismiss, far more personal, and it took longer to resolve. When Joanne Walters' body was recovered, her right hand was partially closed, and clenched in her fingers were several strands of hair. The assumption, the terrible implication, was that she had reached out during the attack and grabbed hold of whoever was closest to her. Initial testing concluded that the hair did not belong to Joanne Walters. It did not match Ivan Milat either. The technology available at the time could go no further than that, and so the strands went into evidence bags, and the evidence bags went into storage. And for more than 20 years, the question of whose hair Joanne Walters reached for when she died remained open. By 2009, police were on the record confirming they had preserved a small number of untested strands for future analysis, waiting for forensic science to develop the tools to say something definitive. And the wait stretched another decade. And when the hair was finally retested, using methods developed partly through collaboration with world-leading laboratories in the UK, the result was unambiguous. The hair was Joanne Walters' own. Her DNA, her hair. Former Detective Clive Small, the man who had led Task Force Air and knew this case better than almost anyone alive, made a public statement. There were, he said, no longer any outstanding forensic matters. The hair had been the last piece of physical evidence pointing toward the possibility of a second person, and it was gone. And as far as Clive Small was concerned in that moment, Ivan Milat had acted alone. But we now return to that word, inevitable. Justice David Hunt used it in his 1996 sentencing remarks, not to describe the conviction, not to describe the sentence, but to describe his belief that Ivan Milat had not carried out these murders alone. And so what was it that he saw, that he knew, that made him certain enough to use that word in that context? The physical evidence of the killings themselves had pointed in that direction from early in the investigation. 6 of the 7 known victims had been killed in pairs. making it much harder for an individual to keep them under control. Multiple weapons had been used across the different crime scenes, and in some cases bullets had been fired from several directions simultaneously, which is physiologically difficult for one person alone to achieve. Forensic psychologists and pathologists who were called to give evidence during the investigation had suggested that the varied character of the killings, some frenzied and impulsive, others methodical and controlled, could point to two different psychological profiles present across the same series of crimes. The defence at the trial had used this ambiguity to try to direct suspicion elsewhere in the family. And as we mentioned, police had investigated several of Milat's brothers, and none were ever charged. The forensic retesting of Joanne Walters' hair eventually removed the single most significant piece of physical evidence pointing to a second person at the scene. But the judge's word doesn't go away, and the family history as it has emerged over the years does not make things any simpler. Shirley Milat, Ivan's sister, with whom he lived at the time of his arrest, was present when the house at Eagle Vale was searched and the victim's possessions discovered. She removed an unlicensed firearm from the backyard and gave it to another brother to dispose of. She was fined $1,000 for that, and she died in 2003. Ivan's mother, Margaret, who had publicly proclaimed his innocence, visited him in Supermax in 2001, not long before her own death. Her younger son, George, noticing something was different about his mum when she returned from that visit, asked her directly. She told him that Ivan had finally admitted his guilt to her. She died shortly after, in October 2001, without ever repeating that admission publicly. And George later said of his sister Shirley, she was in on it. He was careful to say he could not claim she had committed the murders, but in on it. Those were his words. When the list of 58 names was finally made public in 2025, newspapers focused on the number. It is the sort of number that immediately grabs your attention. But numbers are strange things. They're useful for governments and police databases and parliamentary inquiries, but they are less useful for understanding loss. Because 58 names are not just 58 names to the people who knew them. They are bedrooms left untouched, birthdays that kept arriving, mothers waiting by telephones, families who spent years convincing themselves that maybe, somehow, the next knock at the door would finally be the one they're waiting for. And amongst those 58 names are a handful of cases that investigators have never been able to quite let go of. Cases that seem to circle Ivan Milat again and again, no matter how many years pass or how many new sets of fresh eyes look over the case files. One of them belongs to an 18-year-old named Peter Letcher. Peter disappeared in 1987, 2 years before Deborah Everest and James Gibson became the first official victims in the Belanglo timeline. 2 years before anyone knew there was a serial killer operating on Australia's highways. Years later, investigators examining Peter's death noted links between the firearm involved and weapons later associated with Milat. It wasn't proof, it wasn't enough for a charge, but enough that Peter's name has never quite disappeared from conversations about the case. Enough that decades later detectives were still talking about him. And then there are the Newcastle incidents. 3 separate names, 3 disappearances within 4 months. Robin Hickey, who was just 18, Amanda Robinson, 14, and Leanne Goodall, 20. All vanished from the same general region between late 1979 and early 1980. There was no dramatic crime scene for any of the three, just young women with their whole lives ahead of them. They were there one day and gone the next. At the time, they were considered separate tragedies, but years later, investigators realised something that made them look at the cases differently. Ivan Milat was in the region at that time, working on road crews, moving throughout the district and living the ordinary life he always appeared to be living. And suddenly, the similarities in the cases were harder to ignore. 3 young women, the same region, the same period, a convicted serial killer who'd been working nearby while they all vanished. In 2002, Milat was called to give evidence at a coronial inquiry examining these cases. It produced no charges, no breakthrough, no final answer. But the fact that investigators felt compelled to put Australia's most notorious serial killer in the witness box for these 3 missing girls tells its own story. Coincidence, of course, is always possible, but coincidence has a way of becoming uncomfortable when it starts to repeat itself. What makes these names stand out from many of the others on that massive list is not just that they fit, it's that they fit so perfectly. The age, the vulnerability, the geography, the timing. They don't require elaborate theories or impossible journeys across the continent. You don't need to imagine Milat secretly flying to another state or living a second life that had no trace. You only have to imagine him being exactly who we now know he was. A predator moving through ordinary Australia, looking for opportunities and finding them, perhaps far more frequently than we ever thought. And there are other names too, many of them. Anna Lever in South Australia, Nancy Grunwald here in Tasmania, young women in Western Australia. They're missing backpackers, travellers, hitchhikers, people who seem, at least on paper, to fit the general pattern. But the further you move away from the physical locations that Milat was known to be, the harder the certainty becomes. And certainty is important because there is a danger in cases like this. Once someone becomes famous enough, every unsolved disappearance starts to gather around them. Every mystery begins to look like part of the same story. And sometimes that instinct is right, but sometimes it isn't. And that can do a real disservice to the cases of those who are missing. And the truth is that we don't know how many people Ivan Milat killed. We know for sure that there were 7. The courts proved 7, and everything beyond that exists in a fog of suspicion and probability and unanswered questions. But even Milat's younger brother, in a later interview, said simply that there were numerous more bodies that had not been uncovered. And that holds some weight. And let's return to that question of help. But let's look at it from a slightly different angle. What if it was a different type of help? When people talk about serial killers, they often talk about potential accomplices. A lookout, a driver, a second person standing just outside the frame. The person who helped bury the body or clean the weapon or lure the victim into the car. Ivan Milat's case has, justifiably, always attracted those questions. We've asked plenty of them in this episode already. And for decades, people have argued about brothers and sisters and whether there was someone else in the Belanglo State Forest, smoking cigarettes, drinking beer, watching, maybe even helping. But there's another way of looking at it, because when you step back from this case, a different question begins to emerge. What if Ivan Milat didn't need an accomplice? What if what protected him for so long to let him get away with this was something far more ordinary? Consider the moment we began this episode with. Paul Onions, amazingly, survives. He escapes. He reaches safety and he walks into Bowral Police Station and reports an armed man who had pulled a gun on him and produced a length of rope from the back seat of a vehicle. The description of the perpetrator is detailed. The circumstances are extraordinary, and yet nothing happens. Well, not enough, at least. And so years later, when investigators revisited that report, they found no substantial investigative file, only a brief notebook entry. The man who tried to kill Paul Onions simply drove away, and the years that followed became the deadliest years of Ivan Milat's life. It's tempting to imagine a conspiracy, and Jeremy Buckingham, the New South Wales MP who brought the list of 58 names to light when he successfully pushed for a parliamentary inquiry into Milat's case, did exactly that. He raised allegations that Milat may have had ties to organised crime or even been protected by corrupt interests within the police force. But so far at least, little evidence of that has emerged. What the case reveals instead is something both less dramatic and far more unsettling. It's a long chain of small failures, a report not followed up effectively, a witness perhaps not believed, a suspect not connected to earlier allegations, a pattern that nobody recognised until it was way too late. These are the sort of mistakes that are perhaps excusable when viewed individually, but they're the sort of mistakes that become catastrophic when we pull them all together. And then, of course, there was the family. Throughout the investigation and trial, members of the Milat family repeatedly found themselves explaining things that should not have required explanation. Victims' belongings appeared on family properties, alibis were offered, dates shifted, stories changed. An unlicensed firearm disappeared from a backyard shortly after police attention intensified. None of it proved their participation in murder. But they didn't have to be next to Ivan in the Belanglo State Forest to play a significant part. They were helping him in a very different way, providing shelter, providing excuses, providing just enough doubt to keep difficult questions from being asked. And perhaps there was a third layer of protection as well. The era itself that we're talking about. Australia of the 1970s and 1980s was a country where hitchhiking was common. Young people disappeared and were often assumed to have left voluntarily, and records of these disappearances were kept on paper. Police districts rarely shared information the way they do today through connected computer systems. A young traveller could vanish hundreds of kilometres from home and leave behind little more than a missing persons report in an outback town. The vastness of the country worked in Milat's favour, and so did the assumptions of the time. All of this leads to an unsettling conclusion. Perhaps Ivan Milat's greatest advantage was not a brother in the forest, or a secret accomplice waiting in the shadows. Perhaps his greatest advantage was that dozens of people, institutions, and systems each failed his victims in tiny ways. There was never enough to attract attention, never enough to look suspicious, just enough to keep him free. Year after year, victim after victim, until the bodies in Belanglo finally forced everyone to see the picture that had been sitting in front of them all along. Ivan Milat died on the 27th of October 2019. He was 74 years old. He'd been diagnosed with cancer 5 months earlier and had been moved from Goulburn Supermax to Long Bay. Police visited him in his final weeks, hoping for some sort of confession, hoping for something they could take back to the families of the 58, or even the 7. But he gave them nothing, as a unique, but perhaps predictable postscript to this sad tale. His great-nephew, Matthew Milat, was sentenced in 2012 to at least 30 years in prison for the axe murder of a friend in the same Belanglo State Forest where Ivan had buried his victims. In court, it emerged that Matthew had gloated about the killing afterwards. He had said, That's what the Milats do. Strewth. Thanks for listening. This episode was actually voted by the followers of Strewth on Instagram and Facebook. We set up a bit of a poll a couple of weeks ago to celebrate this, our 50th episode. So thank you all for being on this journey with us for 50 episodes. And if you don't want to miss out on being part of the next vote on the episode that we're going to cover, make sure you follow us on Facebook or Instagram. And if you want more Strewth in your life, remember to jump on over to Patreon and sign up to Strewth Premium. For just $5 a month, you'll get early access to all of our regular episodes, completely ad-free. And you'll also receive a bonus episode every week. We're up to about 14 now, so you don't want to miss out on those. There's some rippers in there. Anyway, thanks again, and I look forward to catching you all next week. Cheers.